Hello and welcome to this session on freedom and care, the final public event in the inaugural Critical Poetics Summer School. The Summer School is run in partnership with Nottingham Contemporary, Nottingham Trent University's Curated and Created, and Metronome. Tonight's event is hosted by Nottingham Contemporary, and I'd like to thank them and our other partners for all their support. So the theme of the Summer School is care, which Joan Tronto defines as everything that we do to maintain, continue and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. But what does care and what does living well mean in the context of current social, political, economic and environmental crises? And how can writing, art and theory help us to care for ourselves, for others and for the planet? Over the past 10 days, we've been honoured to host a range of writers, including Astrida Neymanis, Michael Rosen, Nat Raha, Raymond Antrobus, Banu Kapil, Maya Chowdhury, Eva Giraud, and Marion Coutts to explore different ways of writing about, towards, and with care. For this evening's event on freedom and care, we're thrilled to be joined by Maggie Nelson in conversation with Siôn Hewitt. Maggie Nelson has been described as one of the most electrifying writers at work in America today. Writing across autobiography, art criticism, theory, and poetry, she's the author of acclaimed works including the New York Times bestseller and National Book Critics Circle Award winner, The Argonauts, The Art of Cruelty, A Reckoning, a New York Times Notable Book of the Year, Bluets, Something Bright Then Holes, The Red Parts, and Jane, a Murder. She's also the recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship, an NEA Fellowship, an Innovative Literature Fellowship from Creative Capital, and an Art Writers Fellowship from the Andy Warhol Foundation. She currently teaches at the University of Southern California. Her most recent book is On Freedom, 4 Songs of Care and Constraint, which will be published in the UK by Penguin in September. The book explores the kinds of radical care needed to negotiate our complex interrelation with and inseparability from others. And we're delighted that Maggie will be reading from and discussing On Freedom this evening. Later, Maggie will be joined in conversation with poet, lecturer and critic Siôn Hewitt. The recipient of the Northern Writers Award, the Resurgence Prize and an Eric Gregory Award, Siôn was last year selected by the Sunday Times as one of their 30 under 30 most promising artists in Ireland, and his debut collection, Tongues of Fire, was shortlisted for the Sunday Times Young Writer of the Year Award. His book, J.M. Singh, Nature, Politics, Modernism, is published by Oxford University Press, and his memoir, All Down, Darkness Wide, is forthcoming from Jonathan Cape in 2022. He is currently the first poet in residence at the Irish Queer Archive in partnership with the National Library of Ireland and Court International Literature Festival. It's a massive honour to welcome both Maggie and Siôn to our Critical Poetics event this evening. And now, Maggie, over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. It's so great to be here wherever we are. We're suspended in boxes and with you in cyberspace. So anyway, I'm glad to be here. I wish I could see you all. Siôn, thank you for doing this. I can't wait to read your memoir in 2022. And Siôn's poetry is so trenchant and beautiful that I'm just, it's an honor that he's taking the time to talk to me. I was asked to read to you all for some time, and I am going to, I'm going to fulfill what was asked of me, but I'm aware of the fact that listening to somebody read for 30 to 40 minutes on this platform can be trying. So feel free to, mill about and do what you're doing and just take my words in alongside whatever it is that you're puttering around and doing. I wish I'd seen more of what you all have been talking about for the past 10 days. I feel like I'm slightly concerned that I come in at the end as something of like a care skeptic. But I think that the reasons why I feel why I feel the need to inhabit that posture will be clear by what I read. And also the introduction to this book on freedom makes clear in a way that I can't quite, reading part of this chapter, that there's become a kind of customary habit of mind of opposing freedom and care. And I think that is leading into a kind of world of trouble. And so some of this book about freedom and care is about trying to lead out of that cul-de-sac. So I'm going to read the first 19 pages of this chapter called Art Song. And I just wanted to say that I think that what was important to me in this chapter was to write from the perspective of who I am, which is somebody who is both a critic, but also somebody who makes things. Not that criticism isn't a thing to make, but that I think artists and art and creative writers sometimes have a different relationship to some of the terms that are valorized by critics. And so this chapter comes out of trying to think in and around being in those different positions. So with no further ado, I will read the beginning of this chapter. I'm going to read 3 sections. They're called The Aesthetics of Care, The Orthopedic Aesthetic, and Reparative Redux. We'll see if, hopefully that won't take more time than I have planned. So the aesthetics of care. And this is apropos to where we are right now. So a few years ago, I was asked to be on a panel at a museum discussing the aesthetics of care. The invitation read, in a year 2016 marked by divisive political rhetoric and acts of exclusion, the question of care has newly and forcefully emerged within cultural discourse. What might an aesthetics of care look like today as a deep structure that might drive artistic practice, formally and materially? How do ideas of care as a form too of love transform the aesthetics of protest? How does art survive? How can we care for it? And how can it care for us? End quote. The event never got off the ground, but the invitation got me thinking. In a world in which so many do not have enough care, indeed are aggressively, often punishingly uncared for, or are regularly coerced into caring for others at the expense of themselves or their loved ones, not to mention a world in which the regular triumph of something we sometimes call freedom over and opposed to something we sometimes call care may very well end up responsible, not just for much past and current suffering, but for extinguishing planetary life as we know it. In this scenario, the urge to seek and valorize care in everything, including in art, makes sense. This urge correlates to the demand, coalescing in activist circles for some time now, for a politics of care, defined by Greg Gonzalez and Amy Kopinski as, quote, a new kind of politics, organized around a commitment to universal provision for human needs, countervailing power for workers, people of color, and the vulnerable, and a rejection of carceral approaches to social problems, end quote. It also finds inspiration and echo in the work of scholar Christina Sharp, who along with others has imagined care as, quote, a way to feel and to feel for and with, a way to tend to the living and the dying, end quote, and linked it specifically to art making and art viewing. Given my interest in all of the above, why, I wondered, was my first response to an aesthetics of care as something that would extend beyond an animating principle for certain artists, yuck. In pondering, I realized that while I've always taken issue with art that aims to endanger or terrorize its audience or participants, I've never gone to art looking for care, at least in any direct fashion. In fact, I've often felt that art's not caring for me is precisely what gives me the space to care about it. Certainly, I have been moved and nourished by some art that is motivated by care, just as I have at times felt myself motivated by it, even if I usually suspect that motivation. But I have also long valued art's not caring as a portal to forms of freedom and sustenance that differ in key ways than those engendered by politics, therapeutics, or direct service. As artist Paul Chan has it, Quote, collective social power needs the language of politics, which means, among other things, that people need to consolidate identities to provide answers, to make things happen. Whereas my art is nothing if not the dispersion of power. And so, in a way, the political project and the art project are sometimes in opposition, end quote. Acknowledging and allowing for this opposition when it occurs is not the same as cordoning aesthetics off from politics. It is about attending to and allowing for differences between sensibilities, between spheres, and between types of experience, and letting go of the insistence that aesthetic and political practice mirror each other or even correspond amicably. This is especially crucial when it comes to the call to care, which is a much trickier rallying cry when it comes to art than it may initially appear. This trickiness has to do with art's status as a third thing between people, whose meaning, as Jacques Rancière has it, is owned by no one, but which subsists between artist and spectator, excluding any uniform transmission, any identity of cause and effect, end quote. Whereas care can slip quickly into paternalism or control when it is not experienced as care by its receiver. And here, think of the last time someone did something you didn't want or like because, quote unquote, they cared about you. Art is characterized by the indeterminacy and plurality of the encounters it generates, be they between a work and its maker, a work and its variegated audience, or a work of art in time. Its capacity to mean differently to different viewers, some of whom who have not yet been born, and some of whom died long ago, will always complicate any judgment that pretends certainty about any given work's meaning, or that purports that meaning to be self-evident or fixed. This indeterminacy has never kept critics or curators or panel organizers from participating in the age-old sport of imbuing a philosophical, political, or ethical concept with a positive valence, or a negative one, as with Hitler's degenerate art, and then gathering art under its rubric. Progressive and conservative critics alike, for lack of better terms, play this game, insofar as both often embrace the premise that art has a moral function, such as showing us how to live, encouraging connection, or underscoring another value, be it care or community or beauty or honor or subversion or sociality or wildness. In literary circles, philosopher Martha Nussbaum has become well known for the reading novels can make us better people argument. They have to be the right novels, of course. Master of Relations, Henry James, gets a thumbs up, Solipsistic, Samuel Beckett, thumbs down. Many critics have run poetry through a similar sieve, as when Juliana Spar argues in Everybody's Autonomy that, quote, when we tackle literary criticism's central question of what sort of selves literary works create, we should value works that encourage connection, end quote. But how can we sort out which works encourage connection and which ones don't, when the one thing all art does, even Beckett's, is transmit a signal, put forth a communication, which is by no means ontologically invalidated as a transmission if it expresses misanthropic, opaque, or antisocial elements. Such underlying moralism may be one reason why abstract theorizing about art can take a bit of an embarrassing turn when it runs into actual works of art or artists, who often prefer that the field of play remain less codified or less sanitized. Here, for example, is painter Amy Sillman recounting a talk she attended by Franco Berardi. Here, this is a long quote from Sillman. So, I recently heard Franco Bifo Berardi give a talk about not working, something that does not make a lot of sense if you actually like working in your studio. Finally, he made a distinction between work and art, saying that to make art is to make something beautiful, meaningful, erotic, empathetic. And as usual, when this is the language used to describe what we're doing, I wanted to barf. We're not making sexy beasts. If anything, call it libido instead of erotics. But we want an art also animated by ugliness, destruction, hatred, struggle. Punk seems as close as one could get to describe it. But what could be less punk than staying up late in a studio trying hard to make a better oil painting? It's so earnest, so caring, with a smock, our tongue between our teeth, paintbrush poised, trying so hard, like the artists in a Jerry Lewis movie. So what are we doing? I can still only call it looking for this fragile thing that is awkwardness. This is not alienated labor, not a commodity precisely, but a need, a way of churning the world as your digestive system churns food. End quote. Someone's wanting to barf echoes my yuck. Both are visceral, admittedly juvenile attempts to repel the critic's dogged desire to convert a corporal, compulsive, potentially pathetic, ethically striated or agnostic activity into something beautiful, meaningful, erotic, empathetic. Both cleave to art as a metabolic activity, a way of churning the world, rather than as something in need of defending, alchemizing, or otherwise proven socially worthy. Note too that Silman's version of caring for art conjures the simple image of an artist in her studio trying to make a better oil painting. Caring for art, so far as most artists are concerned, often means finding the space, time, proficiency, and determination to make the best thing possible, whatever that means to her. For those who remain disproportionately engaged in providing care for others, which still typically means women, this caring may also entail figuring out how to suspend or offload the burden of caring for others long enough to be able to stand around in your studio with your smock on, paintbrush poised. So when I write about art, I try to keep this wanting to barf in mind. I try to imagine approaches that don't moralize or nauseate, knowing that we all have our hobby horses. Openness, nuance, context, indeterminacy might be mine. I try to keep in mind the artist's body, what it feels, what it wants, what it's compelled to try, along with the knowledge that failure, aesthetic and otherwise, is an integral, inevitable part of the process. I try to keep alive Susan Sontag's simple question, posed in Against Interpretation. What would criticism look like that would serve the work of art, not usurp its place? For this is not just a matter of how to write good criticism, or how to keep criticism in its allegedly proper place, that is, subservient to the genius art that gives it rise. It's also an ethical matter, insofar as Sontag's question reminds us that the world does not exist to amplify or to exemplify our pre-existing tastes, values, or predilections. It simply exists. We don't have to like all of it, nor remain mute in the face of our discontent. But there is a difference between going to art with the hope that it will reify a belief or value we already hold, and feeling angry and punitive when it does not, and going to art to see what it's doing, what's going on, treating it as a place to get, quote, the real and irregular news of how others around us think and feel, end quote, as writer Eileen Myles once put it. Hang on one second, I'm gonna keep going here, but I was telling these guys before we started that we're having like climate apocalypse here, and I'm trying to get my temperature regulated. So, okay. So that was the first section. This is this next one. It's called The Orthopedic Aesthetic. Okay, so all the above I just said. So went my thinking in a 2011 book called The Art of Cruelty. In that book, I examined the legacy of claims made by the historical avant-garde about the salutary effects of representing, or more rarely reenacting, cruelty, violence, and shock. I treated these claims with skepticism, but I steered decisively away from blanket statements about what representations of brutality do or do not accomplish. Instead, I argued for the importance of attending to context and the indeterminacy wrought by time, which transmutes the initial meaning and audience for works of art, not to mention one's own shifting feelings about them. I tried to dramatize this argument via narrating my own expeditions into turbulent areas of 20th century art, hoping to model a certain openness and curiosity throughout, along with the happy freedom of knowing I could turn away when I saw fit. This is a condition provided by art more than by life. As Sontag reminds us about the latter in regarding the pain of others, there is not going to be an ecology of images. No committee of guardians is going to ration horror, and the horrors themselves are not going to abate. That's the end of Sontag's quote. I was critical throughout my book of what art critic Grant Kester has called the orthopedic aesthetic. That is, the avant-garde conviction that there is something wrong with us that requires artistic intervention to fix. Even as I recognized that this conviction animates much of the art that I care about. But since having strong expectations of what other people should feel, or how certain work should make them feel, is not usually a recipe for their autonomy or liberation. Rancière's formulation that, quote, "An art is emancipated and emancipating when it stops wanting to emancipate us," end quote, served as my enduring guide. That book, The Art of Cruelty, was published just a decade ago, but its arguments would seemingly merit an update. Now that 20th century debates over the merits of shocking the bourgeoisie have been largely displaced by a discourse about when and how certain transgressions in art should be called out and held accountable, with the twist that now the so-called left is often cast, rightly or wrongly, in the repressive, punitive position, with the right-wing morality police appearing newly, if hypocritically, selectively, even sadistically enthralled by disinhibition, lawlessness, debauchery, and freedom and fun. I'm thinking here of the ex-lawyer for the neo-fascist group, the Proud Boys, who says that group stands for, quote, "love of country, small government, freedom, and fun." Or I'm thinking of self-proclaimed dangerous faggot Milo Yiannopoulos, who describes himself as, quote, "an artist who's going to create provocative, dangerous things that counter the oppressive, corporatized fucking boredom of the mainstream, extreme, progressive left pride movement." And he'll counter those things with, quote, the fun, mischievous, dissident magic that made the gay community so fantastic in the first place," end quote. Now, this reversal might sound strange, but it is not, in fact, novel. The idea that artistic transgression aligns with what we might now call progressive politics or social justice is belied by the very birth of the avant-garde, marked for many by the 1909 founding and manifesto of Italian Futurism, in which its author, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, introduced the concept of hygienic violence that would wreak havoc in the century to come, and famously proclaimed that his movement, Futurism, would, quote, "glorify war, the world's only hygiene, militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of freedom bringers, beautiful ideas worth dying for, and scorn for woman," end quote. Not but a decade later, Italian Futurism, which pioneered the poetic and typographical innovations known as Parola and Libertà, words and liberty, along with a host of other radical aesthetic activities that presaged performance art and punk rock, officially merged with Mussolini's National Fascist Party. So, at a time when bigots and thugs deploy free speech as a disingenuous, weaponized rallying cry, it makes sense that some would respond by criticizing, refusing, or vilifying the discourse of freedom and postulating care in its place. But care demands our scrutiny as well, as do the consequences of placing the two terms in opposition. For beyond today's tinny stereotypes of bully and snowflake, target and troll, defender and supporter, perpetrator and victim, lie dimensions and archives of artistic freedom of critical importance for all makers and viewers. Attending to these freedoms while engaging the grave issues that have necessitated their interrogation has become our charge. The current interest in care has multiple roots and vectors, including socioeconomic analyses of the crisis of care wrought by racial capitalism and neoliberalism, long-standing feminist debates over an ethics of care. Sometimes this is opposed to an ethics of justice. High-profile political battles over over access to healthcare, an intensified focus on self-care and healing as critical components of activism, Foucault's late writing on the care of the self, which notably grew out of an earlier focus on practices of freedom, a renewed interest in the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas, wherein care and responsibility for others precedes and takes precedence over individual freedom, and the reparative turn in queer studies, initially forged by theorists Eve Sedgwick and Jose Munoz, both of whom emphasized the operations of sustenance, reparation, and utopian world building in the activities of artists, writers, and their audiences. The reparative turn, as applied to art, is in many ways a continuation of the orthopedic aesthetic, with the difference being that the 20th century modeled imagined the audience as numb, constricted, and in need of being awakened and freed, hence an aesthetics of shock, whereas the 21st model presumes the audience to be damaged, in need of healing, aid, and protection, hence an aesthetics of care. In The Year in Shock, a roundup published in Artforum shortly after the 2016 election, critic and curator Helen Molesworth articulated this shift. And proposed that we might be in the middle of a new avant-garde, this time characterized by what she calls continuous self-reflection and regard for others, rather than an urge to counter shock with shock. Despite my skepticism of the urge to delineate artistic movements or avant-gardes, I do see the value in noting such a shift, especially as it displaces, arguably for the first time in art history, a certain aggression or machismo from the notion of vanguardism, itself a military term, and imagines instead, as Molesworth puts it, continuity or gentleness as a potential, quote, hermeneutic of radicality, end quote. Now, community care is not a new element in certain radical traditions. The Black arts movement, the Chicano art movement, certain manifestations of happenings, and later relational aesthetics have all experimented with community service and care provision, be it offering food, shelter, murals, education, or alternative venues for living, loving, organizing, and making art. The shift that Molesworth is here noting thus has more to do with altered affect than historical rupture, and reflects the rise of therapeutic notions of trauma and healing that are distinct from, though not unrelated to, previous stresses on confrontation or bellicosity. These developments interest me, as does some of the art that corresponds to them. What troubles me is the alleged reverse, that is, the trend toward diagnosing some art or artists as caring and some as not, and treating the latter as treated as capable of wounding, traumatizing, or otherwise inflicting harm for which the artists or the curators or the publishers' freedom then becomes subject to blame. One can hear this discourse at work in a recent review of the German artist Kai Althoff. Here's a quote from that review. Althoff has said in the catalog for his recent mid-career retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art that he does not care, this is a quote from him, he does not care what others seem to perceive as violent, end quote, in his work, that he, quote, mustn't step into the world like he's walking on eggs, end quote, and that being an artist means, quote, being graced with being able to do whatever occurs to him, end quote. Althoff seems to view acknowledgement of harm as an infringement on his right to do as he pleases. That's the end of the review quote. So in this, we can find a compressed version of a series of presumptions that have been congealing in recent years. That depicting violence in art, or certain kinds of violence in art, harms others. That there exists some kind of ethical imperative for the artist to acknowledge that harm, even if she doesn't agree with the premise. That not caring about or not responding to or not agreeing with one's critics, including not making or doing or saying what those critics would prefer you make or do or say, is ethically negligent. That treasuring the freedom to make the art you feel most driven to make correlates to a generalized claim to, quote, do as one pleases, analogous to shooting someone on Fifth Avenue, as we now like to say. I mistrust this rhetoric, just as I distrusted that of regenerative violence and raping a viewer into independence in The Art of Cruelty. That latter phrase belongs to filmmaker Michael Haneke. It seems to me crucial, and even ethically crucial, to treat with caution any rhetoric that purports to have all ethical goodness on its side and acts to expel, as Judith Butler has put it in The Force of Nonviolence, quote, the flawed or destructive dimension of the human psyche to actors on the outside, those living in the region of the not me, with whom we disidentify, end quote. This is especially so when it comes to art, insofar as artists often make work precisely to give expression to complex, sometimes disturbing dimensions of their psyches kept elsewhere under wraps. It also seems to me crucial, even ethically crucial, that whatever reparative intentions or effects a work of art may have be left unscripted, unchaperoned, and recognized as subject to change in time. Now, this latter always risks appearing ethically insufficient, insofar as caring about art's capacity to unfold in time, marshals care toward unknown audiences and unforeseeable futures as much as or more than it does toward present spectators and demands. We live, after all, in the present. The present is inevitably the context for our reactions and response, and it matters. Yet one of art's most compelling features is how it showcases the disjuncts between the time of composition, the time of dissemination, and the time of consideration, disjuncts that can summon us to humility and to wonder. Such temporal amplitude understandably falls out of favor in politically polarized times, in which the pressure to make clear which side you're on can be intense. New attentional technologies, such as the internet, social media, that feed on and foster speed, immediacy, reductiveness, reach, and negative affects. Some of these negative affects include paranoia, anger, disgust, distress, fear, and humiliation, only exacerbate this pressure. As Eve Sedgwick makes clear in her well-known essay, it's a great title, so I'm going to read it, the full title, Paranoid Reading and Reparative Reading, or You're So Paranoid You Probably Think This Essay is About You. A strong theory, and this is a term she borrows from Sylvan Tompkins, such as paranoia, has a particular relationship to time. Sedgwick describes this relationship as distinctively rigid, at once anticipatory and retroactive, averse above all to surprise. That is to say, a paranoid mindset presumes to know in advance, retroactively, quickly, and totally what something means now, what it will mean in the future, and what should be done with it. This mindset may be fruitful in politics, though even that is arguable. It is also a sensical, defensive response to an environment in which racism, sexism, homophobia, etc., run rampant, but are constantly being denied, in which case paranoia is the natural byproduct of being continually gaslit. But as Sedgwick realized, the efficacy of paranoid reading, even when our paranoia is justified, has limits, and the benefits of its application to art are especially shaky. After all, if we already knew what the point or effect of a piece of art was going to be before we made or experienced it, if its message could be delivered to us by a TED Talk, PowerPoint presentation, op-ed, protest sign, or tweet, if its interpretation were a preordained lockstep affair, why would we bother with the slow work of looking, making, reading, or thinking? Speed, immediacy, reductiveness, reach, and negative affect. These are all characteristics of what Sylvan Tompkins called strong theory. What follows here then proceeds unabashedly under the sign of weak theory. Weak theory does not set forth a new linguistic or conceptual register such as that of the rhetoric of harm, attempt to shepherd a wide variety of phenomenon under its rubric, also known as concept creep, and demand that others assent to its terms. Instead, it emphasizes heterogeneity, and it invites a certain epistemological uncertainty. It is undisturbed by inconclusiveness and mess. It takes its time, as well as the risk of appearing weak in an environment that privileges muscle and consensus, not to mention one in which concepts such as nuance, indeterminacy, uncertainty, and empathy are regularly ridiculed, sometimes with good reason, as both sidest buzzwords of the civility police. My wager is that a rigorous devotion to it, that is to weak theory, especially one that acknowledges the value of strong theories along the way, enacts its own form of care, both for the issues of our day and for art as a force that blessedly does not reduce to them. And now, as a shocker to you, Sean, I think I'm actually going to end there because it's been about 40 minutes. And I think that that's good enough because my mouth is dry. So anyway, Alice, we'll end there instead and we can talk.
That was great, thank you. That just gives me more time to ask you loads of questions. I've got far too many anyway. So welcome everyone. I haven't said hello to you. Just a reminder that if you want to ask a question of Maggie yourself and stop me from hogging all the time, you can put it in the YouTube chat box and it'll be fed through to me here. and I will try to get to as many as possible. Maggie, thanks so much for that reading. I'm really glad actually that you, I'm not glad that you ended, but I'm glad that you ended on this idea of weak theory, because it seemed like a really useful and open-ended place to begin a conversation. I want to start though with the book's title. So for everyone that hasn't seen it, I'm lucky enough to have got a copy. It looks like this. But it has a subtitle, On Freedom, 4 Songs of Care and Constraint. And I wanted to start by asking about the word song there. It seems to me, perhaps it links in with this idea of a weak theory, in that perhaps the term song differs from essay or treatise or argument or whatever it might be. And it made me think of Denise Riley, who I know you're familiar with because you quote from her work in your book. But when I read that, I heard Denise's apart song in my head with that first line that I can never dislodge. You principle of song, what are you for now? So I wonder if actually I'm beginning by having Denise Riley ask you a question. What is song for? Why song?
I love that. I love Denise Riley. And as you say, I mean, it's funny because reading her poems when I was 18 made me become a poet, you know, in part. And I've been reading her ever since. And so writing about her most recent book in this book was a kind of form of trying to pay some homage. So I'm glad to start with her. And yeah, I think that you're right that songs, you know, is ostentatiously different from essays or chapters or other things that I could have used. And I like titles of books of mine that I like. You know, I have like Jane and Murder and The Art of Cruelty, A Reckoning, and I like, you know, I'm interested in, I'm not really interested in like literary genre. I'm interested in kind of links between literary genre and other ways that art and nature, other things like come into being, you know. So I like to think of subtitles as a moment of doing that, you know, as opposed to underscoring or reifying literary genre. I think in some ways the song is kind of a little bit of an in-joke with myself, in that this is a pretty, I don't know if you all, whoever's there on YouTube, experienced it this way and hearing me read, but it's a pretty, it's a more scholarly or critical-ish, idiom that I some of my work is, more weighted towards that, and some of it is more weighted towards the lyric. So I think, I mean, it would be very didactic, but I could probably put all of my books from like Bluets or The Argonauts or The Art of Cruelty or this book like on a kind of scale of like how they kind of work with lyric and the personal, and how they work with scholarship and criticism. I know, Sean, that you do scholarship as well, so I'm sure you're familiar with this slide. So I think to me, even though this book has a lot of footnotes and took a lot of research, I do think of each of these chapters. There's one on art, one on sex, one on drugs, and one on the climate. I do think of them as a kind of long songs, and they have movements, like they kind of have like they're whatever, they don't have much. They have no lyric structure, but they have this kind of, 18th century, like the sections are put in titles at first. But I think of those as kind of naming different movements that each, and some of them are, I mean, they've all been made of a piece now in tone, but as I wrote them, some of them were like crankier than others, some of them were more inspiring than others, some of them were more depressed than others. So I did think of them all as songs with parts,
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear you say that, because this book is, I mean, people won't have read it yet, right? It's out in September. And you're right, it does have a scholarly atmosphere, but then you also hear your voice all the way through it, and at least in my reading, perhaps the final two songs seemed perhaps more personal, or to allow an anxiety or uncertainty to come through. But I wonder if song as well, and perhaps this is just a testament to the subtitle, drew my attention to the relationship between perhaps song and freedom, and how that seems to be something that lyrics are preoccupied with, this kind of flight of freedom, of the romantic artist singing, or the lyric. Now, your title has freedom and care, and these two terms, and of course it's impossible to kind of sum up the argument in an answer, but I was Googling, there's this Google tool, I don't actually know what it's called, but you can track the use of words over time, like how common they are.
Oh, wow.
So I took the liberty.
I don't know about that. I would never stop using it. Yeah.
So I took the liberty of putting in freedom and care to see what came up. And
I can't wait to hear what happened.
1700 to 2019, that was my scope.
Oh, wow.
And it doesn't let you get to 2021. And I typed in freedom, and we are currently riding close to the peak of its usage, but the peak was in the 60s, which perhaps is not surprising.
Yeah.
Care, though, has never been used more frequently than in the past decade. But still, freedom is used about 3 times as much as care. And I wonder if that kind of sheds a light on your arguments, or your thinking. Does care seem more necessary as a kind of modulator of freedom, or a modifier? There's sort of a paradox that emerges in your thinking between care and freedom. So I wonder if you could speak a bit about the relationship between those two things and how it emerged to you.
Oh, Lord. I mean, I think that I mean, it's no accident that, obviously, as I kind of doing that little litany at the beginning of this chapter of all the reasons why care would be on the rise and why we'd be seeking it and everything. I mean, I think, as the climate chapter makes clear, I personally think that underneath all of our anxiety and anxieties about care is a kind of, I wouldn't even call it unconscious. I would say it's more like species biology than that, of like that we know without knowing that we know, but our species, our bodies know that we're living on a planet in trouble, and I think that we know that our carelessness has been spelling trouble, if not, finitude for our species. And I think we know that. So I think that there's a way in which, that there's and then you add on to all that, everything else about, all the other forms of injustice and uncare. So I think that there's no accident there with that. I think that what I try and point out, at the end of that art chapter, vis-a-vis Saidiya Hartman's work and some other people's work, is that care has a relationship to coercion, and there's a reason why people resist a call to care that's not just because they're not nice people. And I think that without understanding, especially a kind of racialized and gender sexualized history of who's been called to care, literally doing the work of the labor of care for others, then there is not going that just a generalized call to care is without an acknowledgement of its history of coercions, is not going to work. And I also go over a little bit, even kind of like, even kind of happy seeming democratic socialist thinking that kind of in the lines of Marx, just kind of saying like, oh, we need more, we just need to kind of push down need and things we do because they're necessary, and kind of amp up things we do that are more in the realm of freedom, which is actually what Amy Sillman's talking about that Berardi quote, when he's talking about working, and she's querying what is work and what is art and what's its relationship to work. I think all these things are really, need is not going anywhere. and to have a version of freedom that depends on being unencumbered, as Wendy Brown says, will always produce a class of people who will be encumbered with making that unencumbrance possible. So there's a lot to unpack there, and I think I tried to pick 4 subjects where I thought that there was something about the smash up of kind of desires for freedom and the kind of call to care that are troubling, you know, with either the drug drive and the kind of call like to the addict to care about what they're doing affecting other people, and how that's not it's an understandable urge that people have, but it's not typically you know all the there's a great book, its name is escaping me right now, but that I read, you know, about the opioid crisis in the States, and, you know, and it's so important to understand that there's something actually kind of cruel about the idea that if enough love is offered, like if a mother's love is good enough or enough care is offered, then, you know, that person will choose to stop taking drugs for you. Like there's a lot of cruelty in that, unacknowledged cruelty. So I think that, you know, in each chapter I kind of tried to take some really hard instances that had these things wound up in each other, and look at them with you know, with a certain kind of rigor and a lot of compassion. You know?
Yeah, I mean, compassion is one thing that rings all the way through the book. I loved right towards the end, you had a line about climate, and the title of your song is "Riding the Blinds." Maybe you could start by explaining that title for people, and then I'll carry on with the rest.
Riding the Blinds is stolen from Fred Moten and Stefano Harney's book, The Undercommons, which is a really important book to me and was important. I think there's probably a lot stolen in here from The Undercommons, but I think that, you know, Moten and Harney talk in a conversation at the end of that book about the way that they put phrases and ideas like the surround or like the undercommons, like they kind of inject them into, you know, the bloodstream of like of people who are interested in thinking, and they give some kind of ideas about what to do with them, but then they kind of, you know, both let themselves and others kind of invite them to, like, you know, take them for a ride, like riding the blinds, which is, I believe, a term first used in the blues that they use. So Moten says about one of their terms, they say, oh, that's the first term we used, and then we, you know, and then we started riding the blinds, and it means to, you know, ride between train cars and to not know where the train is headed, and it's a form that hobos, you know, would use to not be caught by the authorities while riding the train. But as I describe in the climate chapter, you know, riding the blinds is great because you're out of the way of the police, but you're also, you know, you don't know where you're going, and it's dangerous, you know.
Yeah.
And that's a situation that I was analogizing to the climate crisis. You know?
Yeah, and it's a great metaphor. The thing that really struck me was you were quoting from Tim Morton's Dark Ecology, and I think you said it was like a Tibetan Book of the Dead sort of a thought experiment through climate crisis, and the difference between this and activism and optimism and all of these choices that we might have. And in a really beautiful sentence, you say, moving between these modes is not just an intellectual exercise. It involves letting ourselves be flooded by ferocious love and experimenting with how that same love feels with a lessened grip. Mm-hmm. And so to come back to compassion and love, which is coming through here, and joy and pleasure and all these things kind of pulse through this book, and I think underpin a lot of it. Mm-hmm. That term ferocious love involves a sort of fire in it, a sort of loving as letting go, the bravery of embracing or riding along. And I wonder if you could speak a bit more about that. Did that appear as kind of the best, I mean, solution is not the word, but the best approach, perhaps, the best way of thinking or doing by the end of the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think that quote that you read about the ferocious love and then experimenting with reducing its grip is that, like, even though, I mean, I had a climate activist friend read this chapter, you know, and I kind of worked with him on, you know, he was kind of like, in previous renditions, I think it was like too, well, not like too dark, but like too weighted, like away from thinking and talking about action. And it wasn't what I meant to do. But I think what I was trying to do was to say, like, most people that you talk to about the climate, when they talk about their our understandable, you know, it makes sense. The scale of the problem makes sense, such that people feel overwhelmed and paralyzed about what to do about it. And I think but that feeling, which is, you know, it's an affective feeling, can be and often is an impediment towards people doing anything, because they just, you know, it's probably, you know, the most overwhelming problem, and people experience it as the most overwhelming emotionally in a certain way. So I think that so I did feel like that chapter had to do, like, as you say, it was not really an intellectual exercise, you know, as much as it was also, I mean, there's a kind of Buddhist subtext moving through the book, and that part about letting go of the grip, you know, there's a kind of spiritual wisdom or tradition that I'm thinking of, kind of encouragements, like when someone that you love very much dies, to kind of experiment with, like, you know, what I've read, you know, one Buddhist text saying, like, why make such a big deal out of it, you know, and which just seems like a extraordinarily heartless thing to say. And I don't recommend anyone listening say that to somebody who's just lost somebody important to them, as many of us probably have in this pandemic. But what I mean by it is experimenting with, just for a minute, what would it mean to understand life and death, and death's, you know, death and life and its omnipresence so thoroughly that there was one part of you that could understand what it might mean to not make such a big deal out of it, you know, what, just experimenting with that.
There are a couple of audience questions, so I want to
Okay.
ask a couple of them, just in case, you know, you vanish, and
I know.
I don't want to have monopolized the conversation. So there are a couple. Finn asks, control seems to circle the title's keywords too. Freedom as an alternative to control, and care as a form of control. I'll read that again just in case. Control seems to circle the title's keywords. Freedom as an alternative to control, and care as a form of control. Why constraint and not control as the shadow of freedom and care in the title?
That's so interesting. I wish, Finn, you were here and we were talking, because I would like to talk a lot more with you about that. I think that constraint is a word that, so I didn't think about control when I was choosing that word. I mean, I did think about restraint, but restraint is typically something that a person does for themselves, you know? And control obviously is usually, it has a connotation of something external upon you. Constraint seems to me like it can go either way. Like it can both be something you do yourself as a form of constraint, like people, like a constraint has an artistic, you know, people often talk about constraints, as I'm sure, Sean, you know, as a form of, I mean, asana is a constraint, right? So there's a, but I think it can go either way. It can be a restraint that you choose voluntarily, and it can be a form of control imposed upon you from the outside. So I think that's why constraint is the word. Also, it has a C, and so does care.
And I think as well, you know, one of the parts of the book, I've forgotten which essay it was in, which song it was in. You talked about the possibility of kind of imagining constraint as a choice, or like a form of freedom. And there are quite a few places in the book where you really closely attend to the various unfreedoms that we desire, and perhaps don't talk enough about. And this paradox between this ultimate freedom, which seems to us to be perhaps, you know, in a linear way where we ought to be headed. And the more difficult moments or impulses for unfreedom or to become a subject, I think, in drug fugue. And I wonder if in some ways that prepares us in your thinking for the Riding the Blinds, the climate song too. But that idea of unfreedom as something not to be denigrated, perhaps, too quickly, was really interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think in all of these chapters, but especially probably with the drugs and sex chapters, the desire to, I mean, the need to talk about the desire to give up autonomy or to submit to something, and to not have to be in control is very powerful. I mean, I think it's why people often, what they're looking for in sex and drugs. And then, of course, in both cases, there's a very dark side to not being in control, you know.
Yeah, there was a great quote that you had from Chelsea Hodson, her essay on Pity the Animal. She talks about kind of, you know, the danger of sex sometimes, and unsupervised, I had my choice of dark rooms. I knew which rooms were bad, and I entered them anyway. It was a sort of power, and I found that so powerful. But that idea that we might imagine, we might weigh up the dangers and desires, and we might make a choice, and that might be I suppose, a form of ethical freedom that we don't reckon with too often. I mean, there were some ideas in here. I think before you were cut off, when we were talking about ferocious love, that phrase from Riding the Blinds, you mentioned having run that essay by a friend. And I wonder if that is something you do often, because now thinking about this, the Ballad of Sexual Optimism, there were places that you went in this, in your argument, that I can't imagine were easy or without, you know, you talk about the cops in the head, but I imagine the cops in the head might emerge at some point when writing something as careful as this, because getting the right nuance in the argument is important. So I wonder, is that something you do often? Do you give these ideas to other people and see how they react? And how do you get rid of the cops in the head when writing about these subjects that require you to toe a careful line?
Yeah. I just want to also check with the technology. Like I can see, I look a little like frozen-ish. Are you guys free? Am I frozen to you or no?
Not to me.
Okay, great. Okay, wonderful. These are great questions, Sean. They really hit exactly on many of the things that I thought so much about while writing the book. I mean, yeah, this book, I mean, like all things, yeah, like different chapters, I definitely farmed out to different friends who were more kind of expert, as it were, about their subject fields, you know. And I think that, you know, certainly the art and the sex chapters were probably the most thorny in terms of like what you describe about getting the tone right, because because of the necessary reckonings underway in the art world and the kind of really degraded conversation about artistic freedom, that was very tricky. And then in the sex chapter, because kind of what you say in that Hodson quote, because of the kind of specter of asking for it that like stands ready to punish specifically women for being sexual subjects, it's very difficult to reckon with urges towards unfreedom, but I think it's really crucial, or I wouldn't have done it, because I think without reckoning with it, we just don't get anywhere really, because we continue talking. I mean, as I talk about kind of like a lot of Me Too stories, there's this terrible paradox about them where they're so valuable and they're so necessary and they're so courageous. And yet at the same time, kind of unintentionally, they contribute to a very well-worn archive in which women, in order to make clear their complaints about the behavior of others, they have to come off as maximally, innocent and not necessarily as seeking anything sexually, or only trying to repel. And that is, and that never, it continues to disallow these very sticky, fascinating explorations that are so much of interest to me, and that I think are more common, or I've found more commonly among queer writing, because sexual liberation and sexual complexity is kind of a given in those spheres, in a way that it's been more difficult in heterosexual. That's why, like that piece of Hodson's you read, I admire the risks that piece takes so much. And the cops in the head, yeah, I mean, I think you have to write you have to explore what you want to explore, and then, as you say, I think it's really a matter of like getting the tone right. And the great thing about getting the tone right is that it's not really cops in the head, like at that point, that are like, oh, you shouldn't say that, or oh, people are not going to like that. It's not really like that, I think, as much. So it moves from that kind of cop in the head, from being more of a like, do I sound like it, like an impatient reactionary jerk, and how do I like peel that layer off, like write that and let it burn away, and then do it again, and then do it again, and then do it again, until you actually really say, the kind of, the deeper truth of what you feel, and all those feelings we experience normally throughout our day, like, oh, I'm not sure about that, or oh, that guy's a jerk, or all of that just burns off, and the criticism can operate on like a different level.
Yeah. I mean, are these things that you find yourself able to articulate outside of the writing itself, or does the idea develop nuance through that drafting process? Is it something that kind of exists within the book in a way that is difficult to deal, like you're saying there, with you go through different moods or different reactions to everything all the time, and sometimes I wonder if you find getting it down on the page and redrafting it through helps you to arrive at that really high level of nuance that you have in that chapter, especially the Ballad of Sexual Optimism.
Yeah, and it just, it's where all the work is, but it's frustrating only in that it takes a lot of time. I mean, it takes like a lot of time, like years of time, because like I don't always know what I think. I think a lot of opposing things. I mean, I have a kind of litany at the end of the Sexual Optimism chapter where I'm talking about, see if I can find it quickly, but where I say, I say our desire to treat everyone with compassion, kindness, forgiveness, and also to throw harmful assholes off a cliff is a big koan. Practicing freedom in a world full of shitty circumstances is a big koan. Our desire to retain control over what happens to our bodies while also seeking experiences of surrender and abandon is a big koan. Our desire for increased protection from institutions while insisting they get the fuck out of our lives is a big koan. Like it goes on and on. I list a million of them, but like those are the kind of moods that we ricochet between. But I think that especially for those of us who identify as like being on the left or something, that one of the biggest ones has to do with like trust in the state to do good things for us versus a kind of anarchist desire to dissolve the state. And like, I mean, these are really unacknowledged. We run into so much trouble when we try and think together. So I think it takes a lot of time. Like I would revisit my pages all the time when I would go to work and be like, oh my God, like I don't believe this, and I think that's okay. Like it's why it doesn't bother me if people, like someone the other day said, I I think I most enjoyed myself reading your book when I disagreed with it, because then I could finally see what I thought. And like, that seems to me very good, you know, if that's like an effect. I think that would seem very good. It wouldn't bother me at all, you know.
Yeah, no, that's, I mean, that's one of the ways that we learn, right? But by fitting ourselves into something complex and working ourselves out via it or in relation to it. One of the overarching ideas of the book, I mean, there was a quote from Judith Butler that you had. It was about grief. Now, I should have made a note of it, obviously.
I think I know it off the top of my head. Is it the one that says, let's face it, we're undone by each other, and if we're not, we're missing something?
Yeah, that was exactly it.
Yeah.
And I wonder, actually, if being, I mean, this is a big question, but does being fully human involve acknowledging that we aren't free of each other, and that actually that entanglement, that being undone by each other, is part of the richness of life? And so this idea that freedom is our optimal endpoint, and this comes into something I want to ask you about too. Does an injustice to what living is, or what relations are?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. And I would also just add that I think that it's what makes love so hard, because within it we vacillate between wanting to be entangled and responsible and present, and then feeling those things to be you know, feeling like we're losing ourselves, feeling like we're coerced into doing something we don't want to do, feeling like we're, you know, we don't I mean, I'm a parent, right? I treasure being responsible and present for my son. Does that mean every moment of the day I experience that as something that I've chosen and I feel as a pleasure? No, you know? So I think understanding that that's all part of it can make us more, you know, forgiving for the variety of experiences that we have, you know?
Right, I want to ask you one more audience question, but I'm going to put it into the chat box here so you can see it, because I wouldn't want to hear this question aloud and be asked to answer it. So I'm just going to direct message you here. Let me know if you can see that in the Zoom chat. So for everyone else's benefit, this is from May Lasasso, who was a fab poet who was in my workshop today. So hello, May, glad you're here. In your book, Women, the New York School and Other True Abstractions, you write that the New York School poets like to play with the gaps that invariably occur when one attempts to get one's body into the body of one's writing. My question then is, do you write these gaps into your own work? Do you make space to get the body into the body of your writing? If so, how do you do this? And what do the resulting gaps look like, or sound like, or feel like, etc.? Would you like me to read that again?
No, I'm looking at it. I'm like, first of all, I'm very happy that somebody's read that book. So that's cheery. And I like to play with the gaps that invariably occur when it comes to get. I mean, you know, I think that, I mean, I know because I've spent a lifetime, you know, loving and believing in Roland Barthes when he talks about the sexiest, you know, part of the garment is the part that gapes. You know, I mean, I know that I believe in these. So I think that all of that kind of seeps into the writing. I don't explicitly have a discourse about like the body of the writing or its gaps or how do I get into it or anything like that. But I know that the things that I value and venerate certainly, you know, they inevitably are a part of what I do when I'm working, you
know. All the way through the book, there are parentheses or what seem to be, and I might be wrong here, but what seem to be moments of hindsight from changed context. So I imagine this book took you a number of years to write. And freedom and care, you know, they're almost synonymous with 2020, 2021 pandemic situation. And I noticed when I was reading it that you've gone through and added some parentheses. As you know, you might have said something and they say, of course now, I wouldn't be.
Sorry if it felt tacked on. It was difficult to edit my
No,
book.
it didn't. What I enjoyed about it was that it drew attention to the fact that these are not static things. These are not things that are constantly true, and that context changes everything. So in some way, I wondered if you could talk about that process of well, obviously no one ever knows what context their book is going to be published in. But when this book speaks so closely to the context, was there a process of then having to go and revise or to check, you know, to test your thoughts against the new context in that way?
I mean, the good news is that if you're onto a dynamic that matters, then it's not like it's going to cease to matter, you know, like it's going to keep playing itself out. So I think that the freedom care stuff, you know, it's been, I mean, Wendy Brown, who I make a lot of recourse to in my book, has been writing about these things for, you know, decades, and they only get more and more pertinent, you know, as things go on. Also because someone like Wendy Brown has seen, and others, but has, you know, in following her work, she's seen the kind of authoritarian direction of a lot of the political formations, and has warned for some time about precisely what I was describing in here. As she says later, I quote her, that the alliance of a kind of proto-authoritarian politics with freedom and fun, which we also saw obviously with the Third Reich, is a very I mean, differently with the Third Reich, though, I will say, but you know that, but as she says, you know, the stakes of associating disinhibition and fun with that kind of politics are very very high and very dangerous, because because the feeling of not caring is very intoxicating, and not caring, and so therefore the call to care, if it continues to be experienced as a kind of a kind of, you know, inhibition. Against what you might want to do, you know, now we're getting kind of Freudian, but like, you know, this is a very dangerous psychic formation to pummel in the culture. I unfortunately don't think the left has done a great job of, I think they've fallen into the trap of it a little bit, fallen into the trap that's laid, and the book is, I think, in some ways a response to that. But yes, it was hard to edit during the pandemic, but I think it was interesting in that, and I kind of say this in the introduction, that, you know, Trump was interesting, as I know, in that when I started writing the book, I was onto the fact and looking kind of like you with the Google, but looking at like word clouds of speeches and stuff. And freedom wasn't actually really on his barrelhead. I don't think freedom is very important to him, except for as a, you know, freedom like impunity, you know. The pandemic allowed for a circumstance to rehook, you know, the freedom train to to his train that had been, you know, which is how we got, and I know that y'all have some of this as well, but you know, how we got the kind of anti-masking, anti-vaccination kind of stuff hooked up with a discourse about freedom. But that had been, it was almost like it was looking for something to hook up to, but didn't have one. And then the pandemic created an instance, and then it got a lot of velocity, I think, by making that rehooking things up, you know, like all this delayed and then giving this thing to hook it onto.
Yeah, one of the really interesting things about the book, and you say it right at the start, is I mean, it's one of these terms that I felt almost foolish reading your book for not having considered it before. But you say, you know, it's almost like God, and it means so many things. It almost means something different to everyone. You describe it, the word freedom, as being stamped, I think, like a train ticket, going to many different destinations all the way through the book, and yet still it means something. It just is so multivalent that it can hook onto so many different ideas, and it can be hooked onto. I wondered, and I'll end here. But one of the things that struck me all the way through the book is ideas of time and temporality, because it seemed that two of the forces in the book were a drive forwards. You know, we have the train going forwards, time going forwards, freedom as something that we measure our position temporarily in relation to, you know, how close are we to being free. And there was a quote from Emerson that I loved. To forget us, he talks of a desire to forget ourselves, to be surprised out of our sobriety. The way of life is wonderful, it's by abandonment. And I wonder if that is kind of knocking us into abandoning ourselves into a different temporality, a different space that seems to be an attractive one for us, or something that we would sink into or have to lift ourselves out of, get back on the train again at some point. And you talk about care as having a folded temporality. I'm trying to find the moment where you say it, but in caring, time is folded. One is attending to the effects of past actions, attempting to mitigate present suffering, and doing what one can to reduce or obviate future suffering all at once. I wonder if you could just finish by asking, you know, do you think that recalibrating freedom or understanding freedom requires a new sort of temporal understanding? Is that something that you were conscious of when you were going through the book, these ideas of time and temporality? How?
Yes, absolutely. And everything you say is very right on. And I mean, I think it relates to what you were asking earlier about the lesson grip, you know, when we got cut off, because I think that we already know what we're hurtling towards, which is our death and the death of everyone that we love, right? Like we already know that. And that kind of temporality, that train going forward. And then, like I say in the climate chapter, you know, the climate crisis is so painful because if you really take on some of its challenges, then it's like amplifying what you're already most afraid of every day about what you know is going to happen to you, and then amplifying it like to your species, to your planet, to everything you know in the universe, all forms of animal life. Like this is really hard stuff. So I think that train, that the lessening grip part does come from, I mean, I hate to get all weird on you, but I'm reading this Carlos Rovelli book called The Order of Time, that, you know, that our apprehension of time is an illusion, you know, which is really hard to get at without actually understanding like the physics of it, but it actually is. And there are people and cultures, you know, who've existed and have been, you know, made to suffer greatly, but who've had much more elaborated technologies for touching folded time than we have. And by we, I say this kind of Anglo environment in which we're talking. And I think it's just really important to recognize that one way of like having that kind of not making such a big deal out of something that is such a big deal is inducing or opening up to varying experiences of abandonment to the smallness of our lives and time, and it's extraordinary. I mean, it's truly extraordinary. And so I think touching those places and being able to come back to the kind of ferocity of care that we want to bring to the present is like a form of bringing health into that system, you know. Otherwise, I think we're just we're pummeled and crushed under the weight of our care and love, which you know is as it should be. That's the we're undone by each other. And let's face it, you know, if we're not, we're missing something. It's just that's not, you know, all there is, or the only place where we have to stay in this kind of painful undoneness. That's not all there is, you know.
Perfect. I'm glad we ended on that note of openness and undoneness, entanglement, and all of those things that seem to be There's the seagull, Maggie. Can you hear it?
Great.
I promised
And I
that
wish I
there
could
would be
do
a
a
seagull
workshop.
before you left. So
I know. I'm so
stolen
glad.
my
I'm
final
so
word,
glad.
but there you go. From Denise Riley to a seagull,
Yeah.
and me sandwiched in the
Perfect.
middle. Okay, I'm going to hand back to Sarah now to say goodbye. But Maggie, it was such a pleasure, and thanks to everyone.
You too, Sean. I hope I meet you one
Question.
day. Let's travel again.
Let's go somewhere. Yeah, for sure.
Yes,
All right.
exactly.
Okay. Right. Bye bye.
Thank you so much, Maggie and Sean, for being with us this evening and for your discussion of the rhetoric of care and the often careless or constraining or even controlling ways that the term's been taken up by different traditions, disciplines and institutions. Perhaps because we ended with the discussion of these kind of folded temporalities of care and the sense of the train moving inevitably forward, I'm sitting here with a really powerful sense that we urgently need to think anew about the nexus of art, love, politics and ethics and its relation not only to our past and our present, but also crucially to the possible futures of our planet. So Maggie, it's been a real honour to have you here with us this evening and to offer this preview of the book. And I'm so excited to read it in full when it comes out in September. Thank you. So tonight's Freedom and Care was the final event in the Critical Poetics Research Group's Care of Public programme. And please do feel free to explore all the videos of our events in the series. You can find full details and links at www.criticalpoetics.co.uk/summer. We'd like to thank our partners, curated and created at Nottingham Trent University, Metronome and Nottingham Contemporary, who have hosted this evening's event. And as this is our final public event, I'd like to just add a special word of thanks to Jack Thacker at Nottingham Trent, who has worked tirelessly on the programme, and also to Ryan Kearning from Nottingham Contemporary for all his support and expertise. So books by Maggie and Sean and titles by our other speakers in the programme are available via Five Leaves Bookshop, Nottingham's independent bookseller, and UK customers are entitled to a 15% discount. So to find out more, please see the details in the event description on YouTube or visit the Critical Poetics website. All that remains now is for me to thank Maggie and Sean once again for their art, for their generosity and their insight, and to thank all of you for joining us this evening.